Harold Richardson prided himself on running the classiest, most exclusive restaurant in the city. He called it La Belle Époque, a name meant to evoke old-world elegance, the charm of a bygone era that, to Harold, was synonymous with the good old days when people knew their place. Every evening, the chandeliers twinkled above rich mahogany tables, and soft classical music whispered between the conversations of the well-to-do patrons. For Harold, every guest was a reflection of the restaurant, and he made sure only the right type of people were let in. The warm, welcoming light from the street did not invite everyone. It chose, filtered, judged, and excluded. Tonight, as Harold surveyed his domain from his post at the front, something about the incoming couple set his teeth on edge. A tall black man with his arm around a beautiful black woman, laughing, smiling, as if they had every right to be there. Harold's eyes narrowed. The man, who he would later know as Darren, wore a sharp black suit, and the woman, Monica, wore an emerald green dress that seemed to shimmer under the restaurant's golden lights. A deep discomfort settled in Harold's stomach, a visceral unease that he couldn't fully articulate. As they approached the host stand, Darren's confident demeanor was the first thing that rattled Harold. It wasn't that they were poorly dressed or that they hadn't made a reservation. In fact, everything about them screamed sophistication. But Harold couldn't get past their skin color. He felt a sense of disorder. These people didn't belong here. He had spent decades creating an exclusive atmosphere for those who could appreciate it, and to him, people like Darren and Monica simply did not. "Good evening," Darren smiled, the warmth in his eyes almost mocking Harold's cold reception. "Reservation under Walker." He spoke with a grace that only infuriated Harold further. Harold flipped open his reservation book, his face emotionless, save for the twitch at the corner of his mouth. There it was, 8 p.m. Walker, party of 2. He swallowed his resentment as he gave a tight smile. "Follow me, please," he said, his voice betraying none of his inner disdain. They followed as he led them past the beautifully arranged tables, each adorned with perfect white linen and glistening wine glasses, until they reached a small table positioned inconveniently close to the kitchen doors. It was the table Harold reserved for those who, in his eyes, didn't belong. Darren's smile faltered slightly as he pulled out Monica's chair, but he said nothing. Monica, however, exchanged a brief glance with Darren, a shared, silent conversation that Harold caught but chose to ignore. The glances from the other patrons followed them to the table. White faces turned momentarily, then just as quickly away, as if making a shared judgment. The tension thickened. Darren and Monica sat, their backs straight, their poise unwavering. They had seen those glances before. They knew this story well. Monica squeezed Darren's hand under the table, her smile never wavering. "We deserve this," she said softly, more to herself than to Darren. From his position near the entrance, Harold watched. He thought about how Monica and Darren must have known they were out of place here. He wanted them to feel it. It wasn't enough to place them near the kitchen, surrounded by the noise of clattering dishes. He needed more. With a slight nod, Harold called the waiter, murmuring instructions to make them wait. Let them see what exclusivity really meant. 30 minutes passed. 40. The waiter avoided their table, moving back and forth, serving others with flourish and ease, while Darren and Monica continued to wait, silent, composed, but their eyes betraying their discomfort. Darren cleared his throat, his voice low and careful as he called out, "Excuse me, I think we've been waiting a while. Could you please check on our order?" The waiter shot a glance at Harold, then returned with an insincere smile. "I'll check on that right away, sir," he said, vanishing behind the kitchen doors. Darren exhaled, leaning back in his chair, and Monica gave him a small smile, her hand on his arm. "Maybe they're just busy," she whispered, trying to maintain the pretense of a celebration. But the celebration felt hollow, their 10-year anniversary dinner reduced to nothing more than a lesson on what they were always meant to remember. They were never truly welcome here. As the minutes ticked by, the humiliation began to sting, like a wound that had been forced open, bleeding beneath the surface. Darren could feel the stares from other patrons, and he wondered if they were enjoying this performance, this subtle punishment. Monica's fingers tightened around his hand, her eyes glossing over slightly. but her resolve remained unbroken. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. Finally, Harold approached, a false smile plastered across his face. "Is everything all right?" he asked, the insincerity palpable. He leaned in, his voice barely audible but heavy with malice. "I must admit, we don't usually get folks like you here. Quite a surprise." There it was, the carefully concealed barb, the reminder that they didn't belong, that this space wasn't for them, no matter how well they dressed, no matter how successful they were. Darren stared at Harold for a long moment, the words sinking in, their meaning piercing deeper than any slur. Monica looked up at Harold, her voice steady despite the fire burning behind her eyes. "We came here to celebrate something important to us. We didn't come here to be reminded of small minds." Harold's smile tightened. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "You can celebrate, just not here. You don't belong. My customers don't need your kind ruining their evening." The words were soft but deliberate, sharp as a knife. Darren pushed his chair back slowly, his eyes locked on Harold. He said nothing for a moment, the tension almost unbearable. Then, with dignity that cut deeper than Harold's words, Darren stood, helping Monica to her feet. She held her head high, and together they turned, walking out through the dining room that had grown unbearably silent. Not a single patron met their gaze. Each face turned away, unwilling to acknowledge the ugliness that had unfolded before them. As they reached the door, Monica paused, turning back to Harold. "You think you're better because you can keep people like us out of places like this," she said, her voice carrying across the restaurant, silencing even the clink of silverware. "But we're not going anywhere. And one day, people like you will realize that no amount of chandeliers or tablecloths will keep us out." Harold watched them leave, his hands clenched at his sides. The door closed behind them with a finality that echoed through the restaurant. A deep, uneasy silence lingered, an unsettling reminder of what had transpired. The same silence that now filled Harold's heart as he returned to his post. He told himself he'd won, but deep down as he glanced at the other patrons, avoiding his gaze, he felt the stirrings of something else, something that felt dangerously like doubt. The following morning, Harold arrived at La Belle Époque with the same satisfaction that had always followed a successful evening. He had once again maintained the integrity of his establishment. He walked across the dining area, nodding curtly to the staff as they prepared the tables for another night of exclusivity. But something felt off. It wasn't just the tension from the previous night, but a deeper unease that settled over the staff, like a storm brewing just beyond sight. Harold ignored it, telling himself it was nothing. Maybe they just needed a reminder of who was in charge. As he approached his office, he saw his assistant, Jane, standing by the door. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she held an envelope. "Mr. Richardson," she stammered, her voice just above a whisper, "you might want to take a look at this." Harold frowned, snatching the envelope from her hands. He opened it carelessly, expecting a letter of reservation, a note of complaint from some unhappy customer. But his eyes narrowed as he scanned the words, each one cutting deeper, unraveling the calm facade he'd built around himself. The letter was a legal notice. Darren Walker wasn't just any customer. He was a lawyer, and a well-known one at that. The letter claimed discrimination, a violation of civil rights. Harold's stomach turned, his face flushed with anger. How dare they? How dare someone like Darren challenge his authority, his right to decide who could eat at his restaurant? "Get my lawyer on the phone," Harold hissed, shoving the letter back into Jane's hands, barely keeping his fury contained. He stormed into his office, slamming the door behind him. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. He felt the world slipping, the sense of control he so desperately clung to, unraveling piece by piece. By noon, Harold sat across from his lawyer, the letter spread between them on the polished mahogany desk. Richard, his lawyer for over 2 decades, read silently, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up, and for the first time in all those years, Harold saw something in Richard's eyes he wasn't used to seeing. Disapproval. "You should have been careful, Harold," Richard said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "This could get ugly. Darren Walker isn't just a lawyer. He's got influence. He's already brought attention to this." Harold's face darkened. "What do you mean?" Richard sighed, pulling out his phone, showing Harold the screen. It was a social media post, a picture of La Belle Époque, with a caption that read, "Even in 2024, we're reminded of the spaces we're not welcome. Discrimination still lives in places that call themselves elegant." It had gone viral overnight, shared thousands of times. Harold felt the blood drain from his face. He stared at the screen, reading the comments beneath the post. Each one a dagger, each one exposing the reality he thought he could hide behind chandeliers and white linen. People were outraged, calling for boycotts, sharing their own stories of discrimination in spaces like his. "You brought this on yourself, Harold," Richard said, his voice softer now, almost pitying. "You're not going to win this by bullying people. You have to make this right, or you'll lose everything." Harold's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. "I will not be forced into apologizing to people like them," he spat, the words filled with venom. But deep down, something else gnawed at him. Fear, the realization that his power, his sense of control, was fragile, shattered by something as simple as a shared post. The day dragged on, every hour heavier than the last. Harold could see the changes already. Fewer reservations, phone calls from regulars suddenly canceling their plans. The staff moved with an unease that wasn't there before, whispers spreading like wildfire, the tension palpable. By evening, Harold found himself at the entrance again, watching the dining area fill up. Only it wasn't the usual crowd. Many regulars had called out, replaced by younger faces, people who looked around as if daring the restaurant to deny them entry. He saw a young black couple take a seat at one of the corner tables, and a wave of heat rushed up his neck, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Who did they think they were, coming in here as if they owned the place? As if they could just take what he had built and make it theirs. Harold felt the weight of the evening, the unease, the whispers, the disapproving glances, all pressing down on him. And for the first time in his life, he felt something he had never felt before: powerlessness. The night wore on, but it lacked the glamour, the sense of victory Harold had grown accustomed to. The tension never dissipated, each minute a reminder that the control he cherished was slipping from his grasp, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He watched from his post as the young couple laughed together, their hands intertwined across the table. A reminder that no matter what he did, no matter how much he tried to exclude them, they were still there, unbroken, refusing to bow to his hatred. And the bitterness in Harold's heart seemed to grow with every laugh, every smile from that corner table. He tried to focus on other customers, tried to pull himself back to the pride he once had in running the restaurant, but it was no use. The room felt different now, filled with people who no longer looked at him with admiration, but with scrutiny. He could feel their eyes on him, could almost hear their silent judgments. The night dragged on longer than any before, the air thick with tension. Harold could barely keep his composure as he watched the couple enjoying their evening, seemingly oblivious to the disdain that radiated from him. He had always prided himself on his control, on his ability to manage every detail, every aspect of the restaurant's atmosphere. Now that control was slipping away, and with it, his carefully constructed sense of superiority. He turned abruptly, retreating to his office once more. The door closed behind him, and he let out a shaky breath. His sanctuary, the place where he had always felt the most powerful, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on him, the silence deafening. He sank into his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He was supposed to be untouchable, above reproach. But now, with every passing moment, the foundation of his world was crumbling. As Harold sat there, the echoes of laughter from the dining room seemed to mock him, each sound a reminder of his failure. He could hear the staff outside his door, their voices hushed, their movements careful. They were afraid of what might happen to the restaurant, to their jobs, to everything they had worked for. And for the first time, Harold realized they were afraid of him. Not in the way they used to be, out of respect for his authority, but out of fear of what his anger and desperation might lead him to do. A knock on the door broke Harold from his thoughts. It was Jane again, her face still pale, her eyes wide with worry. "Mr. Richardson," she said, her voice trembling slightly. There's There's something you need to see. Harold's heart sank as he followed Jane back to the main dining area. She led him to the bar, where one of the waiters had a tablet propped up, a live news broadcast playing on the screen. Harold's blood ran cold as he saw the familiar image of La Belle Époque, the headlines scrolling across the bottom. Allegations of discrimination at high-end restaurant spark outrage. The reporter spoke with urgency, her words striking Harold like blows. The story of Darren Walker, a prominent civil rights lawyer, being denied fair treatment at La Belle Époque has taken social media by storm. Calls for accountability and justice have flooded in, with many sharing similar experiences of discrimination at upscale establishments. Harold's vision blurred as he watched footage of people gathered outside the restaurant, holding signs, chanting. The crowd wasn't massive, but it was enough to send a jolt of panic through him. He could see their faces, angry, determined. They wanted change. They wanted him to pay for what he had done. Richard's words echoed in his mind. "You have to make this right, or you'll lose everything." Harold clenched his jaw, his hands trembling at his sides. He had always been the one in control, the one with the power. But now the power had shifted, and he was left standing on the edge, staring down at the consequences of his actions. The hours that followed were a blur of frantic phone calls and desperate attempts to salvage what was left of his reputation. Harold called Richard, his voice cracking as he demanded a way out, a way to end this nightmare. But Richard's response was the same. "You need to apologize, Harold. You need to show people you're willing to change." Harold hung up without replying, his pride too wounded to accept what he knew was true. He looked out at the dining area, watching as the young couple stood up, gathering their things. They left without a word, their heads held high, their laughter still echoing in his ears. They had won, and Harold knew it. They had taken everything he thought he could control and shown him just how powerless he really was. As the night finally came to a close, Harold sat alone in his office, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The walls of La Belle Époque, once his fortress, had become a cage, and the whispers outside were growing louder, threatening to tear it down brick by brick. He had built this place to be a symbol of his success, a testament to his power. But now it was nothing more than a reminder of his failure, a monument to the arrogance and hatred that had brought him to this point. Harold knew deep down that the world was changing, and if he didn't change with it, he would be left behind. But the question that haunted him now, as he sat in the silence of his once proud establishment, was whether he was even capable of that kind of change, or if he was destined to be buried beneath the weight of his own pride as the world moved on without him. A few days after the legal notice, Harold's life had turned into a waking nightmare. The social media backlash had snowballed, growing larger than he ever imagined. He had thought he could control the narrative, that people would forget and move on, but the pressure only mounted. The viral post had caught the attention of news outlets, and reporters began to call, asking for statements, eager to turn his mistake into a headline. Each morning, Harold opened his eyes to a fresh set of nightmares. There were more cancellations, more messages from people condemning his actions. The once bustling La Belle Époque was now eerily quiet. The sound of silverware clinking on fine china had been replaced by the echo of empty tables and hushed conversations among the few remaining staff members. The restaurant, once a beacon of luxury and exclusivity, had become a symbol of shame and discrimination. It wasn't just the customers that were leaving. His employees, too, had started handing in their resignations. Jane, his assistant, had been the first to go, her resignation letter left on his desk without a word. She couldn't bring herself to look him in the eyes after the way he'd reacted to Darren Walker's letter. Harold knew they were ashamed, that they no longer wanted to be associated with the restaurant, with him. Even the chefs who had worked with him for years began to leave one by one, their loyalty crumbling in the face of his actions. Harold's lawyer, Richard, had continued to push him to issue an apology, to try and salvage what was left of his reputation. But Harold was stubborn. Apologizing felt like a defeat, an admission that he was in the wrong, that he wasn't the man he thought he was. And so, instead of apologizing, he doubled down. He called press conferences, spoke to reporters, claiming that the accusations were baseless, that this was all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by people with an agenda. But every word Harold said seemed to only dig the hole deeper. Each defensive statement, each refusal to acknowledge his own prejudice, was met with more outrage, more disgust. People who had once respected him, who had once seen him as a pillar of their community, now saw him for what he truly was, a bitter, stubborn man who refused to change. His arrogance became the focal point of the backlash, with more stories emerging of past incidents that painted him in an even worse light. Old employees spoke out, sharing tales of Harold's thinly veiled biases and the toxic environment he had created. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of damage control, Harold sat alone in the empty dining room. The chandeliers still hung from the ceiling, casting a dim glow over the empty tables. The floral centerpieces were wilting, their once vibrant petals now dull and lifeless. Harold stared at them, feeling the weight of it all settle over him. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built, was slipping through his fingers. The walls that once held his pride now seemed to mock him, the grandeur turning hollow in the absence of the people who had once filled the space with life. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the empty restaurant, and Harold looked up. A young black woman stood at the entrance, her eyes scanning the room before landing on Harold. She walked towards him, her steps confident, her expression calm but determined. She stopped a few feet away from his table, her gaze never wavering. "Mr. Richardson," she said, her voice steady. "I'm Vanessa Walker. Darren Walker is my brother." Harold felt his chest tighten, his pulse quicken. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Vanessa continued, her voice unwavering. "I wanted to see this place for myself, to see the man who thought he could decide where people like us belong." Harold swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had spent so much time convincing himself that he was in the right, that his actions were justified. But standing here, facing Vanessa, he could feel the truth of it all crashing down around him. He had been wrong. He had hurt people, not just Darren and Vanessa, but countless others who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. The realization was suffocating, a weight he had never felt before, one that refused to lift, no matter how much he tried to justify himself. Vanessa took a step closer, her eyes locked on Harold's. "You may have built this place, Mr. Richardson, but it's not yours anymore. People like you can't keep people like us out forever. We belong here, just as much as anyone else." Harold felt his throat tighten, his vision blurring. He had never felt so small, so powerless. The words he had used to exclude others now felt like shackles around his own neck, pulling him down, drowning him in his own prejudice. Vanessa turned and walked away, leaving Harold standing there, the echoes of her words lingering in the empty dining room. He watched as she disappeared through the front door, the silence that followed more deafening than any argument he could have made. The following week, Harold finally did what he had refused to do for so long. He called a press conference, standing in front of the cameras, his hands trembling as he read from the statement Richard had helped him write. He apologized, not just to Darren and Vanessa, but to everyone he had hurt, to everyone he had made to feel unwelcome. His voice cracked as he spoke, the words tasting bitter, but they needed to be said. The cameras flashed, capturing every moment of his vulnerability, every crack in his voice, every droop of his shoulders. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and no amount of apologizing could change that. The community had moved on. The people who had once supported him now saw him for what he truly was. The reservations never picked up again, the employees never returned, and eventually Harold had no choice but to close the doors of La Belle Époque for good. The once iconic establishment was now nothing more than an empty shell, a monument to the consequences of his actions. The windows were dark, the chairs stacked atop the tables, the chandeliers dimmed, an abandoned relic of a tarnished dream. Harold stood outside the restaurant on the day it closed, looking up at the sign that had once been a symbol of his success. It now felt like a monument to his failure, a reminder of everything he had lost. He turned away, walking down the street, the whispers of the world he had tried so hard to control fading behind him. For the first time in his life, Harold faced the reality that he was not the man he thought he was, and that the world had no place for the hatred he had held on to for so long. The city around him seemed to move on without him, bustling and alive, as he walked away from the only thing he had ever truly cared about. Weeks later, Harold found himself sitting alone in a small cafe on the other side of town, a far cry from the luxury he had once surrounded himself with. The people around him paid him no mind. He was just another face in the crowd, no longer the powerful restaurateur he had once been. He sipped his coffee, staring out the window at the people passing by. He saw families, couples, friends, all different, all sharing the same space without a second thought. The sight filled him with a deep sense of longing, a realization of everything he had missed out on by clinging to his narrow view of the world. Harold thought about Vanessa's words, the determination in her voice, the strength in her eyes. He had spent so much of his life trying to keep people like her out, trying to maintain an illusion of exclusivity that had only isolated him in the end. He realized now that the true value of a place like La Belle Époque wasn't in its exclusivity, but in its ability to bring people together. But it was too late for him to change that. The opportunity had come and gone, and all he could do now was live with the consequences of his actions. The cafe door opened, and a young couple walked in. A black man and a white woman, their hands intertwined. They laughed as they approached the counter, their voices filled with warmth and love. Harold watched them, a pang of regret twisting in his chest. He had never allowed that kind of joy, that kind of connection, to flourish in his restaurant. He had been too blinded by his own prejudice, too consumed by his desire for control. As Harold sat there, he realized that his downfall wasn't just about losing the restaurant. It was about losing the chance to be part of a world that was moving forward, a world that was leaving people like him behind. He had built walls around himself, walls that had once made him feel powerful, but now only served to keep him isolated and alone. And as he watched the couple take their seats, their laughter filling the small cafe, Harold knew that those walls would never come down. Not for him. He finished his coffee, leaving a few bills on the table, and stood up to leave. As he stepped out into the bustling street, the world continued to move around him, indifferent to his presence. Harold walked with his head down, the weight of his choices pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had spent his life trying to build an empire, only to watch it crumble because of his own hatred. And now all he had left were the memories of what could have been, and the knowledge that he had no one to blame but himself. For Harold Richardson, the world had changed, but he had refused to change with it. And in the end, that refusal had cost him everything. If Harold's story made you think, don't let it end here. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you believe in a world where everyone belongs, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge the status quo. Let's create change together.